Hey guys, this chapter is about new criticism. Chapter 3 is about new criticism, so this lecture will focus on that. So just to get right into what the chapter deals with, new criticism focuses on the text itself rather than on the context of a piece of literature. So this is a way of viewing a piece of literature that doesn't pay attention to um, the author's life or the historical context or anything outside of the text really. And this will seem counterintuitive to a lot of you guys. A lot of you will want to look up details about the author's life or will want to know what the link is between it and the piece that you're reading. But new criticism is sort of a different way of looking at a text, and what it does is it assumes that a piece of literature can stand alone as a work of art, and that within itself it has meaning that isn't dependent on the context. It isn't that the context doesn't matter or that a person couldn't look at it to interpret the text, but rather that just within the piece you can find meaning and that there's value in doing that. And so the methodology that a new critic would use would be to read a piece of literature closely. So the person would read a poem line by line and examine each line very closely and look at which literary devices are used in each line, what meaning can be extracted from each line. In a short story or a longer work, a reader would do the same thing. So the reader would look at each paragraph individually and examine how meaning is created in each paragraph or in each sentence even. And so really what you're doing if you're reading as a new critic, and by the way, new criticism isn't new anymore. It was new when it was a new thing, what, 100 years ago or something, maybe not quite that. Um, but it's not new at this point. It's just that originally, it kind of became called that. So what a reader would do when looking at a piece of literature from a new critical perspective is consider what ambiguities and complexities are in a text and how those ambiguities and complexities end up sort of reconciling to produce unity and communicate a consistent, coherent thematic meaning. So what is the takeaway? Not a moral, but like a big idea that you take away from a piece. That could be called thematic meaning. We can define thematic meaning more completely as a complete statement about the abstract meaning communicated by a literary work. Not everybody defines this exactly the same way, but this is the way that I would define theme. So it's abstract, it isn't a concrete idea. So theme isn't, oh, the piece is about a chair or the piece is about a person. But what does it say about the chair? What does it say about the person? What's important about the piece? So an abstract idea is not something tangible, it's something intangible. It's an idea as opposed to a thing. And then a complete statement, so just the idea of love isn't a theme. What the piece communicates about love, love is fleeting but pleasant, for instance, is a theme. So consider when you're reading pieces from a new critical perspective what thematic meaning you take away from each piece, and then how is that theme communicated in the piece? So how do the details of the piece combine to communicate that meaning? In this week's module, I've posted a link to the poem The Fish by Elizabeth Bishop. So if you haven't read that yet, just pause this lecture and go read it now. It's not very long, and it's a poem about basically a person who catches a fish and then throws it back. And so the speaker in the poem is describing the fish in detail. First she catches it, then she sort of looks at the outside, she imagines what the inside of the fish is like, she notices all kinds of details about the fish, and ultimately she sort of realizes that the fish is wise, the fish has been through a lot of stuff, it's been caught a bunch of other times. She can tell this because it has a beard of fish hooks and fish line kind of in its lower jaw area. And so she throws it back because she sort of respects it. And so what a new critic would do when looking at this poem is look at which literary devices or which features of form are important in the piece. Now this is not an exhaustive list, but a couple of things that I notice about this poem are that the poem uses a series of metaphors and similes. So it uses a series of, the fish's skin is like wallpaper type statements, or the fish's skin is like the swim bladder is like a peony. Those types of statements are similes if the word like or as is used. It's a metaphor if it's just a simple equation of one thing with another. So if the poem said the fish's skin is wallpaper, it doesn't say that, but if it did, that would be a metaphor. These details don't matter too much, but I want you to kind of consider how metaphor and simile are used in the piece. And then personification, so ascribing human-like qualities to a non-human entity. She starts to imagine the fish as kind of being wise, like a person would be wise, and being experienced, like a person would be experienced. And so in this way, she's personifying the fish. The speaker is personifying the fish. Imagery is language that appeals to any one of the five senses, so language that specifically appeals to our sense of touch, for instance, or our sense of vision. And so all of these types of figurative literary language are used in the piece, and a new critic would find this interesting and would examine this more and would try to look at how these literary devices end up contributing to the poem's meaning overall. So a couple of ambiguities and complexities in the piece that you might notice are, first of all, that Bishop wants to eat the fish. Well, the speaker wants to eat the fish. We don't really know if Bishop is the speaker is Bishop, and it's kind of a jump to assume that. So pardon my overreach there. The speaker wants to eat the fish, but then she also admires it. So she's imagining the innards of the fish packed together like feathers, I think she says. I'm not looking at it right now, but I've read it so many times I can kind of remember parts of it. So she's imagining the innards of the fish and the meat of the fish basically packed together and what it would look like if she cut it open to sort of, I guess, fillet it. But then she also admires the fish, so she kind of respects its wisdom, she respects all the stuff that it's been through, and this we get the sense of at the end of the piece. And this is a tension. Oh my goodness, I hope you didn't just hear that. My phone just went off. My husband texted me. Bad teacher. Anyway, I'm not reading it. I'm continuing with the lecture. I'm not going to start over now. I'm too far in. So, another ambiguity or complexity, a tension, I guess, in the piece is that the fish seems to be both grotesque and beautiful at the same time. So the speaker is equating it to kind of beautiful things such as peonies, which are beautiful flowers that have a lovely fragrance. They're like these pink, beautiful flowers that you have to stake because they flop over. But then also she's imagining its kind of innards and sort of the grotesque aspects of it, and she's like kind of disgusted by it, it seems, but also admiring of it at the same time. There are other ambiguities and complexities in the piece as well, and I'd encourage you to look for those. So what a new critic would do is examine the ways that the figurative language of the piece or the ideas in the piece end up reconciling these ambiguities and complexities and producing a unified thematic meaning. And what the thematic meaning is depends on the reader to a certain extent. I mean, there isn't a correct thematic meaning that I want you to look for in this piece or in other pieces we're reading, but I do want you to practice looking for thematic meaning and interpreting pieces of literature. This is part of the critical and analytical aspect of the class. So possible interpretations or possible thematic takeaways, I guess, from this piece are, first of all, upon close examination of the fish, the speaker starts to admire what is often taken for granted or overlooked. So a fish is sort of an ordinary thing to a certain extent, and she starts to look beyond how it appears and examine it really closely, or she starts to really look at its appearance more closely and examine it on another level, I guess. So one way to interpret the piece would be that it's about noticing that which is often overlooked. You don't have to take that away from it. You could have a different interpretation. Another possible interpretation is that the speaker slowly begins to identify with the fish. She begins to sort of see its humanity or see herself in it. She can relate to it on some level. And ultimately she decides to throw it back after seeing her own humanity reflected in it. This doesn't have to be what you take away from the poem again, but it's a possible interpretation. I left that others bullet point there because I want you to think about how you interpret the piece. And then always consider what details of the piece back up that interpretation. The difference between a valid interpretation and a not valid interpretation is simply whether details from the piece you're reading, from the short story or the poem that you're reading, can support that interpretation. And if they can't, it's not a valid interpretation. If you can find evidence for what you think and you can support it with details from the text, then it is a valid interpretation. So how is this type of criticism, new criticism, different from other types of criticism? What makes this different from just reading a piece and figuring out what you think it means? It's sort of a nuanced answer that I have for this question, if this question is one that you've asked as you're listening to this or as you read chapter 3. So our interpretation of the fish grew out of a close examination of literary form. Now this often is a good starting point for any type of criticism or any reading of a text, but new criticism really privileges literary form and its impact on meaning. Also, we're ignoring context. We're not talking about the culture that Bishop was coming out of when she wrote this, or the time period that it was written during, or the place the text was produced in. We're not asking questions about culture or cultural context, how that might have influenced the piece. We're also not asking questions about Bishop or her life, and we're simply examining the speaker as a literary construct. We're examining this speaker as just the speaker of the piece, and we're not assuming it's Bishop, even though I accidentally called the speaker Bishop on a previous slide. Bad me. We're really not reading into the piece. We're not like assuming that Bishop fished, for instance. We're not asking whether she fished. We're not trying to investigate whether she was an outdoors woman or whether she liked to be outside and whether she liked to hunt and fish and things like that. We're sort of ignoring those questions or bracketing them and focusing only on meaning within the piece.